Today we'll be ranking the albums by UK progressive metal band Threshold. This was requested by Tom the Green Man, and I was asking for some suggestions on band discographies to rank. Feel free to put your ranking in the comments or suggest some other bands for me to rank. I will be doing a few rankings between now and the first few weeks of January until new releases begin to come out. I have 12 albums to talk about, and I'm only covering studio albums. I'm going to do this in chronological order as the band has had lots of lineup changes, so it makes more sense if I do it this way. So let me get into it. I'm going to start with Wounded Land. This is their debut album. It was released in 1993. The album is considered to be one of the first in the UK progressive metal scene. The album has a lot of those Bay Area thrash metal style guitar riffs, as well as melodic and atmospheric keyboards. The album has Damien Wilson, who will be on 3 albums, but the albums will not be in succession. He has a very soulful vocal style, which has been compared to Peter Gabriel or Robert Plant. He also has Tony Grimhan on drums, and it's his only album. And the album has founding member John Geary on bass, core member Carl Groom on guitar, Nick Mitzen on guitars, and the other core member Richard West on keyboards. The title and many of the songs were inspired by the fantasy novel The Wounded Land by Stephen R. Donaldson. Some of the key tracks include Days of Death, which is a darker mid-tempo track with Middle Eastern guitar riffs. There's Sanity's End, which is a 10-minute epic with elements of jazz and heavy metal. There's also Surface to Air, which is a 3-part epic, and also one of the most melodic tracks on the album. I thought it was a decent debut, but I also thought they improved over time. This one will come in at number 9. 1 year later, they released Psychedelicatessen, their second studio album. This one's considered to be one of the heaviest albums. Has a lot more thrash metal guitar riffs than their debut. It also has a very unique lineup. It has Glenn Morgan on vocals. He was brought in after Damien Wilson left the band. He has more of a harder rock style to his voice. This was his only album for a long time, but he will be back later, so stay tuned for that. Also has Nick Harradence on drums, and it's his only album with the band. The rest of the band remained. Album's title is a combination of 2 words, or if you want, I use the technical term, which is a portmanteau, which I'm probably mispronouncing anyway. But it's a combination of the words psychedelic and delicatessen. The album has a bigger sound, and they used down-tuned guitars on a few of the songs. They also did a music video for the song Lost, which was something they didn't do that often in the 90s. The album has 2 remixes, and the band did not like the muddy production of the original. Some key tracks include Sunseeker, featuring a lot of energy. There's also Into the Light, which is the album's 10-minute epic. There's Rising Babylon, another heavy track, which is about the environment. And the track He Is, I Am, one of the more progressive sounding tracks with lots of time signature changes. Overall, pretty good album. I will have it at number 8. In 1997, they released Extinct Instinct. It's their 3rd album, considered to be their most progressive and experimental album at that time. There were more lineup changes on the album. On vocals is Damien Wilson, which might sound familiar as he was on the first album, but he came back to the band. There will also be Mark Heaney on drums, and he will be on the next album. And the first drummer to record over 2 albums, and the other core members remained in the band. The album title was inspired by author Stephen R. Donaldson, specifically The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. Songs are mostly about technology, as this was released during the early years of the internet. Some key tracks include Exposed, which has some of the most aggressive vocals by Damien. There is Eat the Unicorn, which is another one of their 10-minute epics. There is Virtual Isolation, which is kind of prophetic. If you listen to the lyrics now, it's about how people become more isolated with technology, and also has a slow and heavy track called Lake of Despond. I looked over a few rankings online. I saw a lot of people had this one very low, but for some reason I liked it a lot, and more than the first 2. So I'm probably going to rank this higher than normal. I'm putting this one at number 2. 1 year later, in 1998, they released Clone. The album has Andrew McDermott on vocals, and he is going to be their longest running vocalist, and he would be in the band for another 9 years. And sadly, he would pass away in 2011. He has more a soulful voice. I felt the albums with him on vocals made the band sound like King's X or Living Color. This has Mark Heaney on drums, which is his 2nd and last album on drums. The rest of the core members remained in the band. The album is a loose concept about the ethics of genetic engineering. They went for more of a straight ahead and accessible sound, with songs being catchier and more like arena anthems. The album is closer to progressive rock and has less of those thrash metal inspired riffs than some of the previous albums. It has some key tracks such as Freak, which became a live staple. There was also The Latent Gene, which is an 8-minute epic about the morality of manipulating DNA. And they have a melodic ballad called Change and another 8-minute epic called Goodbye Mother Earth. I thought it was very good, and I felt it ranks fairly high at number 5. In the year 2001, they released Hypothetical. This is considered to be their definitive album. It was their most successful. At this point in the band, the lineup was becoming a little more stable, with Andrew McDermott on vocals again, and they finally found a new drummer that will stay in the band for a long time. His name is Johan James. This also has the other core members. I read a lot of reviews for the album saying it was their best. A lot of people say they made an album that was at the same level of their American counterparts, Dream Theater. They also stepped up the production and made a very polished sounding album. As for key tracks, there is Light and Space, which is a very powerful opening track about science and faith. There is a 10-minute epic called The Ravages of Time, which has a nice balance between the heavy and lighter sections. There was also Sheltering Sky, which is more of a melodic track, slightly reminiscent of Pink Floyd. There is Ocean Bound, which is probably the heaviest track on the album. And probably my favorite track is called Narcissus, which is an 11-minute epic about Greek mythology and how it relates to people today. And keep in mind, this was back in 2001, pre-social media, so it's another somewhat prophetic track, but I like the song, especially the atmospheric middle section. I understand why a lot of people give this album a lot of praise. I liked it, and I'm going to rank it pretty high as well, so I'm going to put it at number 3. In 2002, they released Critical Mass. This was the first time they released 2 consecutive albums with the same lineup, which is why it's considered to be a sister album to Hypothetical. The album is not a strictly concept album, but songs have a common theme about a point of no return, whether it's in relation to physics, the environment, or personal relationships. This also has a very clean production with many layers of keyboards and vocals. Some of the key tracks include Phenomenon, which opens the album. The song has lots of energy, and it's about the fear of the unknown. Then there are Choices, which is an 8-minute track with a heavy wah-wah synth solo, and about the philosophical concept of causality. And there's also Falling Away, which is a power ballad about societal apathy. There was Fragmentation, one of the heavier tracks with some chugging guitars, and a recording of a 13-minute epic called Critical Mass, which is divided into 3 parts. And there was also New Beginning, which had lots of heavy guitar riffs, as well as atmospheric keyboards. I thought this was another strong album. I felt it was a very well-rounded album with a nice balance between the heavier tracks and the more progressive rock-sounding tracks. So for that reason, I have it at number 4. In 2004, they released Subsurface, their 7th studio album. There are some reviews saying this is one of the best progressive metal albums of the 2000s, even won Album of the Month in a few European music magazines. And it has a very glossy production value, so I might not rank it as high as some people might. But let me talk about it. As for lineup changes, there's a new bass player named Steve Anderson. He replaced founding member John Geary, and he remains the band's bassist to this day. It's also the final studio album with founding guitarist Nick Midson, and this one has Andrew McDermott on vocals, who was at the top of his game on this album. Title and artwork represent the theme of what we see in the media and politics, which is only a superficial reflection of the real truth, hidden as subsurface. This album has a Queen influence throughout the entire album, especially with lots of vocal harmonies. Some key tracks include Mission Profile, an 8-minute progressive rock track about capitalism and corporate greed. There's Ground Control, which is a catchy driving track with some darker undertones. And there's also one of their most well-known songs called Opium, which talks about television and media as the new opium of the masses. Overall, not a bad album, but I didn't really connect with it as much as some of the others, and something has to come at the bottom. I have it at number 12. Not that I hate it, it's just that out of all the others, this is my number 12. Then 3 years later, in 2007, they released Dead Reckoning, their 8th studio album. I liked this one a lot. Probably it was because of one of the more metal-sounding albums. As usual, the album is important in terms of the band lineup for the following reasons. This was the last album with Andrew McDermott on vocals. He left the band shortly after the album's release, and then he passed away in 2011. It's also the first album without founding guitarist Nick Midson, which means that Carl Groom had to complete all the guitar work in the studio, and they had a guest vocalist named Dan Swano, who provides some death growls on the tracks Slipstream and Elusive. Also the band's first album for the major metal label Nuclear Blast, which also influenced a move towards a more metal or more aggressive or accessible metal sound. Some of the key tracks include Slipstream, which is an energetic opener featuring death growls. There was Pilot in the Sky of Dreams, a 10-minute epic masterpiece and one of the band's most beautiful songs. There was This Was Your Life, which is a straightforward metal track, and I'm going to rank this one higher than so many other rankings because I liked it a lot, and for that reason, I'm going to rank it at number 1. In the year 2012, they released March of Progress, their 9th studio album. It was the band's biggest gap between albums. They were affected by the passing of their singer. A lot of people call this a comeback album. On vocals, we see the return of Damian Wilson, who had not recorded with the band for 15 years. Also the first album with Pete Morton on guitars. He was a touring musician for the band, but it was his first time in the studio. He replaced founding member Nick Midson. The other members are bassist Steve Anderson and drummer Johan James. They remained. Some key tracks include Ashes, the opening track filled with lots of energy. There was Return of the Thought Police, a moody atmospheric track. There was Staring at the Sun, which I liked because it had this Iron Maiden vibe. Overall, I thought it was a good album, although I was not completely blown away by it, but I will rank it at number 10. 2 years later, in 2014, they released For the Journey, their 10th studio album. The album had more of a straightforward progressive metal sound. Also, one of the few times where they had the same lineup as the previous album, but also the last album with this lineup as 2 members left afterwards. This was Damian's last studio album with the band before he left in 2017. On this album, his vocals are more melodic and less aggressive. Also, the last album with Pete Morton on guitars. The rest of the current band remained. Some key tracks include Watchtower on the Moon, which opens the album, comes right out of the gate with lots of powerful guitar riffs. There is Unforgiven, which is a darker mid-tempo track with a killer guitar riff. There was also The Box, which was one of their 12-minute prog rock epics. The album ends with Siren Sky, written by Pete Morton. Also a very heavy and progressive sounding track. Overall, I liked the album. I thought it had a nice flow, and I'm going to rank it at number 7. In 2017, they released Legend of the Shires, their 11th studio album. It's an 82-minute double concept album and includes the most ambitious storytelling. The album has some big lineup changes, most notably the return of Glenn Morgan on vocals. That name sounds familiar. It's because he was a vocalist on Psychedelicatessen from 1994. Also the first album since 2004, Subsurface, recorded as a 5-piece. Carl Groom also handled all guitar duties alone, leading to a more symphonic and cohesive layering of tracks. The album tells a metaphorical story about a person trying to find a place in the world. It was also interpreted as a reflection on the Brexit, which was a big news story in the UK at that time. There are lots of key tracks on the album. They had a big hit with Small Dark Lines, which is also the band's most viewed music video and a live staple. There's also The Shire, parts 1, 2, and 3, which are 3 short acoustic songs. There was The Man Who Saw Through Time, which was a 12-minute epic, as well as Trust the Process, which was another complex track with some heavy moments. There was also Lost in Translation, which was a 10-minute album closer. Overall, I thought it was a decent album, even if it was a little bloated, and I'm going to rank this one in a minute because I have one more. The most recent album was released in 2022 called Dividing Lines, their 12th studio album. It's the only album I had listened to prior to preparing for this ranking video, as it was released while my channel was still active. I think I ranked it somewhere in the top 50 as well. It's also one of the few albums where they retained the same lineup for 2 albums in a row. So hopefully they will continue with this lineup for the next one. I guess they are pretty much due for another album at some point, maybe next year. But anyway, let me also remind you who's in the band again. We have Glenn Morgan on vocals, and he just came back into the band. Then there were longtime members, Carl Groom on guitars and Richard West on keyboards. They were the core members who were on every album, I believe. And 2 other members who were a little newer, but they are now consistently in the band. Steve Anderson on bass and Johan James on drums. Not a concept album, and many songs are about world events, given it was released in 2022. There was a lot of global tension, a lot of political unrest, and they talked about the isolation of the early 2020s. Some key tracks like Haunted, the album opener, one of the more aggressive songs on the album. There was The Defense, which was a 12-minute epic and centerpiece of the album. There was King of Nothing, which was one of the band's catchiest, yet heaviest tracks, as well as Complex, which is a high-energy technical track, as well as Defense of the Brave, which is a big and soaring anthem. Overall, I might be a little biased with this one, as it was the only one I had listened to before. So my final rankings are going to be Legend of Shires, number 11, and this one, number 6. And that's all. Let me know your ranking in the comment section. Check out my recent ranking of Pink Floyd. I will stick that right here. It's a video I just did. And one of those videos I had wanted to do for a long time. Please like this video. Helps me with the YouTube algorithm. Please subscribe if you're not already. I do rock and metal reviews, rankings, and more. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next one.